I'm Shehzad Charania, and it's a great pleasure for me to be speaking today to Ali Velshi for the UK Jamati. Ali needs very little introduction. He's one of the leading television journalists in the United States. Originally from Canada, Ali has worked for NBC, CNN, Al Jazeera America, and currently MSNBC. Over the next 15 minutes, I'll be asking Ali for his perspective on COVID-19, including the political, economic, and societal implications, and also where we can find hope and opportunity in the midst of this global health crisis. Ali, thank you for speaking to me today. You've been in the front line as a journalist during some of the most seismic events of this century, so 9/11, the global financial crisis, and natural disasters. So from your very unique vantage point, can you tell us how reporting on COVID-19 compares to those other events?
Yeah, it's very different. I would say it's most like war than anything else we would cover, because on most of these other things, whether it's a natural disaster or a hurricane or even a terrorist attack, you generally know what the other side of it looks like. It's not an ongoing feeling. Certainly after 9/11 around the world, and for many years, there's sort of an ongoing feeling of a threat from terrorism. But very rarely is the ongoing nature of something that is a threat also existential. People are actually worried about dying, and they're not worried about it from an external source necessarily. It could be everybody around you. And so it's got a whole different nature to it. On one hand, we are frightened by society and we want to separate from people and keep ourselves as immune from them as possible. On the other hand, it has caused us to crave society. Many people want to get back to work. They want normalcy in their lives. They're almost grieving those things that are gone from their lives. So it's a remarkably interesting thing to cover because, first of all, we're all doing these things from our homes now as opposed to studios. I broadcast from my home, and even reporting on news stories. You know, we pride ourselves, whether it's war or terrorism or disaster, or getting as close to the story as you actually can. And now it's all about space and staying back. So it's been a challenge to navigate the societal implications, the health and scientific implications, the economic implications, and the personal implications of these stories, and keep it in a way that it makes sense for people, certainly in a world where we've all got these phones, and so we've got information overload anyway. How do you make it make sense to your viewers? Stuff that they can't Google and they can't already get. How do you make the narrative and the story make sense? And what the feedback we get, Shehzad, from most people is they want to know how this affects them moving forward, right? What is the new normal? When will the new normal get here? And how will I operate it?
Thank you, Ali. We will come back to discussing what the new normal looks like, and we'll also discuss in a bit more detail the implications that you've talked about. But can I first ask you, one of the main criticisms or observations perhaps that people have had is the fact that unlike some of those events I talked about earlier, like 9/11 and the global financial crisis, that there hasn't been that same global response we saw then. Why do you think that is?
I think it has something to do with the way society has moved. We've become a little more isolationist. We are a little more protectionist all around the world. We've had political movements that sort of name the country first, right? The idea that this country ahead of all others. And that has, by definition, weakened some of our global alliances. So if you think about 9/11, global leaders were immediately on the phone. Global intelligence agencies were coordinating with each other, and within hours, the necessary information had been gleaned. And even when, and there are a lot of people who do not support the force that was taken afterwards, but it was coordinated globally. In the recession, same thing. Central bankers were talking to each other on a regular basis and taking coordinated action. So you didn't see different countries cutting interest rates. You saw them all doing it at the same time, all pledging an amount of money to keep the wheels of the economy going. And you saw the world leaders were constantly speaking to each other on an ongoing basis. The world is a different place now, and we don't do that. And I think when history looks back at this time, it'll say that one of the disadvantages of protectionism and isolationism and nativism and populism is this, that when you actually need a global effort to solve a global problem, having the infrastructure in place to be able to activate that like a switch is handy. Remember, we have these switches, right? NATO has something called Article 5, that if any NATO country is attacked, by definition, all other NATO countries are attacked. It's literally like a switch. That these countries are supposed to go into a coordinated global response. We don't have that for the economy, and we clearly don't have that for global and public health. So I think when we come out of this, the post-mortem will be greater cooperation on some issues is imperative.
So you've talked there about the fragmented responses that we're seeing rather than a coherent approach. What do you think it says about the future of our global order that, in fact, many countries with more authoritarian style governments are perhaps having more success in containing the virus than democracies are?
It's an interesting lesson that is emerging from this. You see countries that are completely able to decide what they're going to do and dictate that to their populations, able to control the disease. And look, that's logical, right? On the other side of the spectrum, you have some places in America where there are protests with people who have guns going to state legislatures to protest the stay-at-home orders. So, you know, in certain cultures, we hold freedom above all else. In certain other cultures, we hold the community good above all else. And yet in other countries, it doesn't matter what you hold above all else because it's government that has that control. I certainly hope, as a person who likes democracy, that our takeaway from this is that democracy is not good at, I hope that our takeaway is not that democracy is not good at fighting these things. I think there's an intersection of order and good public policy that doesn't have to be thought of as taking away your freedoms. But this is a complicated issue because we're talking about contact tracing, using your phones to see who you've been near. I live in New York. When we open up for business, most buildings will have cameras, not just so that if you get coronavirus, they can trace exactly where you've been, but thermal cameras to measure your body temperature. You know, after 9/11, after security threats, we tend to allow some of our civil liberties to go away in the interest of public safety, and that discussion is going to come up again here. So in some way, our democracy-loving states are going to become a little bit more like our, our totalitarian states, in that they're going to watch us more closely. Our phones will know where we are more closely. We'll be tracked more closely. And the reason, some will call it an excuse, but the reason here is going to be public health.
And potentially security as well. And, when governments and the public think about threats to national security, we will immediately turn our minds to terrorism.
Correct.
Certainly over the last 15 or 20 years, that's how we've become accustomed to thinking about national security. But do you think then that, based on what you've just said, that this pandemic has the potential to change how we perceive threats and the security and safety of citizens?
Well, it should, right? Because we haven't seen this. I understand why people don't think of these things as serious, because we haven't seen a pandemic of this nature in 100 years. And we have definitely come to think that science and technology are so good that they can solve all these things, that these things tend to happen elsewhere in the world, in places that don't spend much on public health, but they don't really happen here. We saw Ebola, and when it got to the United States, it was quashed. We saw SARS, which seemed very serious at the time, but actually killed very few people. So we have this impression that science and technology are at a level that we don't need to worry about it. Look at all the diseases that we can cure now. Look at all the various cancers we can cure. There are a handful of afflictions that one gets that will actually kill them. On the other hand, we also spend a little less time studying the life sciences and bioscience. So when you go out there, not everybody knows what the difference is between a cold and a flu and a virus and a bacteria and what an antibiotic works on. So I think one of the takeaways from this is we all actually have to be humbled by nature and by the earth. And by the way, this fits into other discussions that we've been having about the climate, right? At some juncture, nature is efficient, as this virus is showing. It knows what it wants, and it is bigger than we are. we will be able to grapple with it, but we will only grapple with it when we make changes to our behavior so that we can go on. And it's clear that if this has happened, something like this can happen again. So I think our threat matrix completely changes now. We just didn't think about these things as not only serious, but existential. And now we're thinking about both. It has brought much of the world to a standstill in a way that terrorism never did.
Yeah, and you talked earlier, Ali, about communities, and I think about from at a local level and perhaps a very parochial level, how, for example, my family now is gathering on Zoom every Friday for Friday prayers in a way that, of course, we never thought of doing previously. So going to that local level, that more societal level, how do you think or how do you see this pandemic is impacting on our communities?
Well, God bless the internet. You know, that Zoom existed, and FaceTime and Skype and Blue Jeans and Microsoft Teams, these things that I would argue that most of society had not engaged in a year ago. I mean, I probably had at best a Zoom meeting every month and a half, and that was only when it was so inconvenient that nobody could get together. And now they are a part of our lives. And as you mentioned, not just our professional lives, our social lives, our religious lives, they are our tie to community. In a conversation with Bill Gates a few weeks ago about the pandemic and about infectious diseases and viruses and vaccines, which he knows a lot about, one point that he made as an internet pioneer is the internet held up. You know, everybody's working from home. Everybody's doing this all the time. So that's terrific. For a lot of people, that will mean freedom, Shehzad. That there are a lot of people who had to commute 2 and 3 hours a day to and from work, and that may change. There may be a lot of companies who say, hey, this works. If it works and you've got the internet, you can work from home. And that might be a great advantage to some people. But we are going to need our community elsewhere. Right? We can't be hermits. We're not made for that in life. And I think the idea that we use these tools to make sure that we do stay in touch with not just our families and our friends, but whatever you consider your larger community to be. One thing I think thought, most of us, is that we need to take responsibility for at least a few other people in our circles. You obviously have to take responsibility for your family and your extended family, but who else belongs in that circle? Your faith community, your neighbors, the service providers who were employed by you before this happened. I do think the one great takeaway of this crisis, this global crisis, is it has caused us to understand what's important, who's important, and in a weird way, that personal touch is important. If we can't actually be with each other and touch each other and shake hands, this is at least a very good way to stay in touch with each other.
And so thinking then, moving from the present to the future, can you tell us a bit more about your thoughts on how the pandemic will shape our future? Ali, what will our new normal look like?
Well, I think a few key things will change. There have been trends afoot that have been very slow to change, and people have been slow to adopt, that are now going to suddenly become mainstream. So meetings where, can I conference in, can I call in, and people would say, no, we really need to be there. This idea of FaceTime, which is very, very important in so many parts of the world in terms of culture and business, will start to now convert into this. We will be able to take these meetings, which, by the way, means that your productivity will increase. Who thought we could increase more productivity than the fact that we've got computers and everybody's got 1 or 2 phones? Productivity will yet increase. There will be blurred boundaries between home and work. And that, for some people, will be terrific. For other people, that will be really bad. Your relationships at home will be tested. If they are good, then this era of coronavirus has been terrific, because, like me, I can spend time with my wife and my son. But there are a lot of people who have, for very valid reason, tension in their home. There are a lot of people in homes that are not safe for them. So we're going to have to understand, how do you reach out and protect those people? In the workplace, trends that were going away are going away. We were slow to adopt online shopping around the world. Well, the acceleration in online shopping and things like buy in store, pick up at the curb, or all the various ways in which we use the internet will accelerate. So some jobs will be lost because there will be people who work inside stores who won't be there anymore. Other jobs will be gained, and those will be delivery and warehousing and logistics. But remember, all jobs are not created equal. So while we are probably adding millions of jobs here in the United States in logistics and delivery and things like that, these tend to be the lowest wages of jobs. So when you look at what we think of as frontline workers, you think about doctors and nurses and nursing home workers and emergency technicians. Well, you're also thinking about doormen and delivery men and wage earners and people who do not have the luxury of benefits. Certainly in the United States, that's a big deal with health benefits, who are going out there to work. So we're going to have to figure out structurally how we protect the least among us in society. And if you were already thinking about that, because those are good things to think about, then this is your moment to double down on it and say, we will all come out of this unequally. And what will we do to step up from a policy perspective in our countries and on an individual familial basis, taking care of those who are going to come out of this hurting?
So Ali, you've talked about some of the risks as well as opportunities around the pandemic. What about the most vulnerable people in our societies? And by that, I don't just mean people with underlying health issues, but actually people within the Black economy, people on 0 hours contracts, are cleaners. You know, when money is tight, who are the, perhaps they're the first people we think about or don't think about when we think about kind of tightening our purse strings. Do we need to be mindful of thinking even more broadly about what we really mean by community and the most vulnerable?
Yeah, I think we do. One of the problems as a journalist who deals with the economy is that the measure of the global economy and our GDP is a total measure, and it looks really good. Net wages go up, net productivity goes up, net income goes up. But when you parse it, what you realize is that people whom you've mentioned, contract workers, gig workers, freelance workers, people in the United States, for instance, many workers don't get health care because health care is tied to your employment. Those people are actually not doing better, but the aggregate does well because the wealthy in society continue to do well. Stock markets perform well, and they will come back again in short order. Property values continue to do well. One of the difficulties in solving for the least among us, because most people are on the right side of this issue emotionally, but they say, you know what, it's very difficult and it takes a lot of hard work and it's expensive. Well, guess what? Everything we are doing right now is difficult, takes a lot of hard work, and is expensive. We are dropping more money into our economies because of this crisis. Why not use that to rebuild? Why not use that to create a world that is inherently safer and fairer and better? And many people do this in their own lives, through their own charity, through their own community work and their own volunteerism. But why don't we then take that and make sure that we elevate it to national levels? It is a counterpoint to the populism and nativism that is going on in many of our countries, but it is an important counterpoint. We are each other's keeper. We are our brother's keeper, and we need to see this. And part of that is the things that you do as an individual, which you should be doing. But part of that is your vote to remember that when you remember the pandemic of 2020, remember that the thing that can come out of it is that we made a fairer and more just society.
Ali, I wanted to talk now about the economy and finance. And we have seen a serious dip in global stocks, including the US. Now, it's not clear what will happen, which sectors will come out of this stronger, which sectors are going to suffer for a very long time. Can you give us some insight into where you think the economy is going and which sectors are the ones we should be looking out for in the future?
So let me speak broadly about this. The history of the stock market is such that it always recovers over time. The issue is how long does it take to recover? And within the stock market, what sectors do well and what types of investments? And if things like this, I don't think anybody would have known well enough to get out of the market in enough time. And by the way, the markets have had remarkable surges since the pandemic. Most people wouldn't think to get back in. So my general advice to people is not to bob and weave into the market, but to remain diversified and maintain that diversification. It sounds so boring, but the fact is the reason you do that is because how would you know when the next thing happens, what sector it's going to affect, right? Cruise lines are a bad investment right now. Hotels, airlines, things like that. The energy sector, bad investment. How would you have known that? But what people tend to do is they tend to think about things as hot sectors. And I like to tell people, as a business journalist for the last 30 years, virtually none of us are smart enough to master that. So for most people, if you invest broadly with a lot of diversification, that can protect you. Now, when I say broadly, it doesn't mean something just like the S&P 500. It means understanding where you are in the world and what other factors are at play. So if you're in the United Kingdom and you have a business there, think about the long-term effects of Brexit and say, hey, should I be more exposed somewhere else in case things don't go well in this immediate sector for the next 10 years? If you're in Houston or Calgary and you are invested in a normal portfolio of things, you also live in a place that's dependent on the price of oil, and perhaps you have a business that's dependent upon the price of oil. So maybe you want to make sure that your investments are not concentrated heavily in energy. There's no other trick to diversification except to be diversified, to invest in different things. And it is, like I said, it's a boring topic, but it is covered well on a million websites and a million books, and it is worth understanding the chapter. There are two kinds of diversity. There's the type of things you invest in, commodities or currencies or stocks, and whether it's stocks, it's mid cap or small cap. Learn all that stuff, but don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's the major lesson that we've learned out of this. Diversified investors will come out on the other side probably okay, as long as you've got a bit of a time horizon.
And so, Ali, you talked earlier about Ebola and SARS, and in fact, this is the 5th pandemic we've seen this century. Of course, nothing on the scale of what we're seeing now. You say that, of course, we're not smart enough to predict into the future the direction of the stock market and the shocks that we'll see. But are there particular factors that we should be bearing in mind, whether it's climate, the environment more generally, as aspects that we should be taking into our consideration when thinking about broader finances and portfolios?
Yeah, I think there are three things that you should think about broadly. One is technology, right? That technology, not in a narrow sense, but in a broad sense. Here in the United States, in 29 states, driving is the #1 profession, right? Nobody drives like Americans drive. We drive a lot. We ship things from coast to coast. They show up in Los Angeles at a port, or in Newark, New Jersey in a port, or in Louisiana, and they get shipped all over the country. When we have autonomous cars, we will go from driving being the #1 profession to probably driving being really low. I mean, obviously it'll take a while after cars for trucks, but we can load and unload those trucks automatically. We can hitch them and unhitch them automatically. So we need to think about this. Today, if your child wants to be a truck driver, it's actually a very lucrative profession, and you do very well until the day that it stops. And think about technology and automation and autonomous and robotics and AI on all of those fronts. What part of your job can be replaced by AI? We now have doctor's appointments this way. Right? That was something doctors were resistant to doing and patients were resistant to doing. Where did it start? It started in remote places. It started in poor countries where there couldn't have been a doctor everywhere. In America, it started in Alaska where you couldn't get to your doctor. Now everybody does it. In London, in New York, those kinds of things. Think about that. Think about our changing demographic in our world. In many places, it is getting older. And while we continue to have these remarkable jumps in science to help cure disease and longevity is increasing, we have an older population. And if you can manage to get your population average age to 95 or 100 or 105 or 110, whatever it might be, think about the extra needs that society will have when people are that old. Not everybody who's 110 can zip around in a car on their own. Now, we've got Uber and we've got Lyft and we've got things like that. But think about the trend changes, both in healthcare. I'm not sure I want to live to 120, but I want to live as healthy as I can be. But think about an aging population and places where there are young populations in the world, but it changes the demands. And think about the climate. You know, one of the problems with coronavirus is it has exposed the degree to which some of our leaders and some of us are not conversant in science and technology. And when you play that out in a longer way, that's how you end up with people being climate change deniers. That's how you end up with people saying that it's not dangerous to smoke. Because if you don't know enough to know what's actually wrong, it creates space for science deniers. So this is a real opportunity for the world to say, look, between coronavirus and climate change, it's time for us to listen to the science, get smart about it, know the difference between a bacteria and a virus, know the difference between this and that, and protect our planet and protect our lives. We are It is important to protect humanity, but we are custodians of something else, and the earth is in our care. So I think these are all trends that you will see in terms of employment, in terms of investment, and in terms of protecting us against the next instance.
Ali, can I finally take you back to your very first question, very first answer, where we talked about reporting during this pandemic? Can I ask you just how you're doing personally? Separate to your job, what's changed for you day to day?
You know, I can't say the changes have been things that will be ultimately bad. You know, we work from home, which has only taught us to be more efficient. We work a lot. Somebody actually said to me on Twitter the other day, "You seem tired." And I said, my tiredness doesn't matter, because I look out my window and I see those first responders, and I see those people working all the time. I think we've all learned, and through the lens of a journalist, we've learned to understand what essential workers really are, and that they're everybody. That everybody's essential. And we have had the system of looking at the world in which you are valued by how much you earn and how much money you generate. And in fact, what we need right now are people who take our garbage away, people who keep our homes clean, people who take care of our elders, people who are home health attendants, people who assist hospitals and doctors, people who are police. You know, I think we're understanding that society doesn't function without the least among us. But I think this is going to go back, you know, down in history as a remarkable time for journalists, because a lot of people have written us off, and I understand why they have sometimes, but now we have a purpose. Now there is something to bear witness to, and now there is power to hold to account. And I hope that when we come out of this, people will have said the news and the journalists and the writers and the reporters helped keep us connected to the story and helped keep us going. So I feel like we're performing a bit of a service. We're certainly not performing nearly as much of a service as the people who are saving lives and keeping our economies going, but it does feel like we're at least in the arena.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you for that fascinating and inspiring insight, and for your time. Thank you.
My pleasure.